All right.
Oh, I know
Yep, just tell Ted to use the arrow keys and we'll be
But
good.
now I'll never know who's asking a question.
I couldn't get my computer connected. I don't know if we have any other computers. We can tell them to talk. They can
Oh,
talk.
okay.
Tell them.
So that's gonna be the problem.
It's almost, it's 11 after.
Yeah.
I don't think many people are going to show up after that.
It was unmarried love, wasn't it, dear?
I've never run into Zoom before.
I didn't to marry her and there was no baby.
That's right.
She agreed she would have got pregnant, don't you worry. I don't know whom she would have selected as a father, but no doubt she had a candidate in mind.
Okay, everybody, we're sorry for the little delay as we set up in the room here. I think we're ready to get started. So I'm Bill Duncan. For those who don't know me, I'm the relatively new president of Wignes, and I'll go through some sort of society activities and announcements before I hand it over to, I guess, Rich tonight's going to introduce our speaker. So first of all, yeah, the Wignes has a lot of activities over the next year. The board's been pretty busy and will continue to be in planning these things. Not only do we have Lisa and Pete have a nice schedule of presenters for our general meetings over the next few months, folks like Ted tonight. We also have a nature photography contest that will be held in April of next year. You can see nature notes for any details there. We'll be doing our spring banquet this year. That'll be in May. We haven't done that in a couple years, so we're excited about that. We're excited about meeting in person like this. Rich brought the 100th anniversary books along. So if you were a member in good standing in 2020 and haven't picked up your free copy, see Rich tonight before you leave. Any other general announcements you can think of? I think we'll be doing our usual winter sort of party in January. And other than that, we can open it up to the chairs of the different natural history groups. Not seeing many of them in attendance. For folks online, we've got we can't hear you through a speaker, so maybe I'll just ask for that. Maybe for the bird group, David, if you'd like to.
Well, our only real announcement is that starting this Saturday, we will get Saturday trips as well as the Thursday ones. So if anyone's interested in attending on Saturday, please let me know.
All right, thanks, David. See John with the book group.
The book group meets.
Hey, John. Speak over here. Read that.
John Christensen, the book group meets the second Tuesday of each month. My emails in the nature notes if you want to attend any of the meetings. Right now they're on Zoom. Or have to see about going live. Don't have that much enthusiasm among the members. Next Tuesday, we're reading The Incredible Journey of Plants by Stefano Mancuso. In October, Remarkable Creatures, Epic Adventures in the Search for the Origins of Species. And November, Becoming Wild, How Animal Cultures Raise Families, Create Beauty, and Achieve Peace by Carl Safina. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So I think I saw Miguel online. Miguel, you want to make any announcements?
Yeah, hey, Miguel Acosta here. Our next field trip will be to Victoria Glades. We're targeting the species of orchid, Spiranthes magna comporum. I hope I'm saying that right.
That's good.
All right, and it's in Nature Notes. I'm going to put it on the webpage. So any questions, feel free to email me, and look forward to having you join us.
Okay, maybe Peggy, anything? Or
We're having Thursday birding. It's at 8 o'clock, and the best thing to do is to send David Betcher, who we heard 2 voices ago, your email. But there's also an exciting and a very exciting bird in the area. It's a limpkin, which is, they're local, very local, way south, like the Everglades and Louisiana. Somehow he's here, although there have been a number of limpkin sightings this year. But anyway, and I think that we really should name him Louis Limpkin.
No.
I don't maybe.
Oh,
Because of him, because
That's
he's
true.
attending the festival.
That's right, he was at the Missouri Botanical Garden. At the lake there.
You have a guest there? You have a guest?
Oh, I'm sorry, did you say?
You have a guest? You have a guest?
Oh, actually, this is my mail carrier from years ago.
Hi, I'm Lori Stringer.
He's wonderful.
We have
I'm happy to be joining you tonight.
a new member that I know about is Stacy over here. She just signed up. I don't know what your interests are.
Yeah, speaking of membership, dues are due this month, so there's still a number of folks who need to do that. So remember, we've got multiple options: annual, 10-year, and lifetime memberships, and you can pay those online and still mail in a check. So don't forget that, please. Anyone else online? We can't see right now a good idea of who's online, but if there are any other chairs online that would like to make their announcements, please let me know now.
George Van Brunt, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just want to say that John Oliver is leading the botany walks, usually on Monday, but not always. Sometimes for various reasons, it's another day of the week. And fall flowers are in bloom now. If you want to come out with us and you're not on the list, Wayne Clark is the one to give your email to. That's all.
Awesome. Thank you, George.
Mhm.
Anyone else? Okay, I think I've stumbled through that well enough. So if there's nothing else, I think I'll hand it over to Rich to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Bill. I think for many of us here, Ted is a person that really doesn't need an introduction. He's very familiar to all of us, or many of us. But for those that are new and or online, let me just describe a few things. I've known Ted for coming on 40 years at this point. Shortly after the Wigness entomology group formed in the 1980s, 1983, I think, Lisa wrote this nice little thing up and I circled all the important things. But in any case, he was there in 1983. I joined shortly shortly thereafter in 1984. And Ted was one of the first people I ran into with this group. He talked me into it. Him and another friend of ours, Phil Koenig, became great friends. And we've been going on field trips and meetings and you name it. We've been doing a lot of stuff over the years together. Some of the stuff I want to just bring up briefly here is that Ted is an entomologist. He went and got his degree from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and got a master's degree in entomology. And that was back in 1981. And then after he got that, then he went on to a successful career in entomology. First as a field scientist for the USDA, I believe it is. No, Missouri Department of Agriculture. Got to get the right organization there. And he would go around to various places and check on nurseries, essentially, for infestations. Then he went and got a job out in California, and we missed him greatly when he was out there, and came back finally when he got a job at Monsanto. And he spent the last 25 years approximately at Monsanto as an entomologist. Became an expert on soybean beetles that went in and other insects as well, but primarily beetles. And did a great, wonderful job making a good career out of that. In addition to doing all this stuff as an entomology, as a scientist at work, what I want to point out is that he also, on his hobbies, is entomology. So it's like he's got this wonderful job. You know, everybody wishes they had a job like Ted's, that they could do exactly what they wanted to do. And he was doing that at Monsanto. And then he comes home and he spends even more time studying specific groups such as cerambicids, the longhorn beetles, buprestids, the metallic wood-boring beetles, tiger beetles. Those are three of the prominent ones. But if you were to ask him about almost any other beetle that you found or show him a specimen, there's a very good chance that he's going to know very closely what it is. So he is definitely the go-to person when it comes to knowing about beetles. Some of the other things he does on the side, and I can't imagine how he did it all, because he was an editor for journals such as Pan-Pacific Entomologist and a couple other entomology journals, and the all-important Nature Notes. You know, you can't be an editor unless you've joined up and been an editor of Nature Notes. And he did the editorship here with Wignes for 10 years. He's also served in Wignes as on the education committee and on the Wignes board from 2009 to 2021. I think one of his claims to fame is that he's got 100 articles that he's written for Nature Notes. Prolific writer. It's amazing. He's got a family, and would you believe he has something else as a hobby, and he's a cyclist as well. And for the past, I'd say 10, 15 years, he's gone to a variety of skills with cycling, all the way up to the amateur version of the Tour de France. So he's a wonderful, rounded, well-versed person in all sorts of things. And tonight he's going to be talking about, and I got to get this one right, the botanist among us hosts specialization in insects. With that, Ted McRae, thank you for coming.
Geez, thanks, Rich. With an introduction like that, I don't know if I'm going to be able to match that, but
You'll be fine.
yeah, no, I appreciate the comments, and Rich is very sincere and earnest in those comments. And yeah, we've shared a lot of great moments out in the field and in meetings over the past almost 40 years now. So I really am honored to kick off the in-person Wignes General Meetings again after a 2-year hiatus due to COVID. So this is a thrill for me, and we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is not just insects, but host specialization among insects. I've become, I was kind of forced into botany because the insects that I study are plant associates, and it's kind of hard to do much effective research on your insects if you don't understand the host plants. course, I wouldn't say it was kicking and screaming because I got intensely interested in botany almost from the beginning. So I don't put myself in the ranks of the true botanists in the group, but I've learned enough to muddle by, and it really informs and magnifies the enjoyment of the insect part of things. So some of this is repeat, but there's a few details that I just want to point out. I did grow up in Kansas City in the inner city. So I'm a city boy. So all of this nature stuff came to me once I had the freedom to get out into the real world and see what that was all about. I did have that 5-year hiatus in Davis, California, but that set me up for being able to go to Monsanto and really do some incredible and enjoyable research on soybean insects there. I've been retired. I retired last year, and I have a feeling that that's just allowed me to become even more busy with the things that I really enjoy doing. I'm sure you're all thinking that that's a very old picture of me up there. I have used this slide in my presentation since then, but I quickly went through and I found a more up-to-date photo that I thought I'd share with everybody. So as you kind of gathered from Rich's comments, yeah, I'm really never happier than when I'm studying insects. And so most of these pictures are from various places around the world. I've been to South Africa, I've been to South America many times. I traveled there for work and as well as on my own quite a bit. And I've been throughout much of the United States. But I really consider myself lucky in the fact that after almost 4 decades of collecting insects, I'm still motivated to get out in my own home state, which I do with regularity and look for insects. And I still am finding new things almost every time that I go out. And when given the chance to talk about insects, you better take a chair. So this is kind of briefly how I've structured this presentation. I think it's really useful to, before we start looking at host specificity in insects, it's kind of helpful to understand really the basic groups of insects and where they fit into their utilization of host plants. So we're going to go through looking at the major groups of plant feeding insects. Not all insect groups have plant feeders. A lot of them are predaceous and many more than we probably realize feed on decaying material. And so we're kind of going to give them short shrift in this talk. But that's okay. There's there's with more than 1 million described species of insects, we just can't do everybody justice. And then as we're going through these groups, I'm going to point out evolutionary themes of plant feeding that really kind of help us understand how plant feeding arose in those groups or why, and how it's been lost or regained again. And having that view will help us kind of understand what is the universe of plant feeding insects that we then have to deal with. And then I'm going to go through just lots of examples of different types of host specificity. Host specificity can refer to a certain species of plant, but it can also refer to a guild of plant types, or it can refer to a host condition. For example, when we get to the wood-boring beetles, we'll see that some species really don't care about what the species of wood is. It has to be at a certain stage of decomposition. And so that is a type of host plant specificity. So this is a really busy slide, but don't worry, we're going to walk you through it. And for right now, all we have to do is pay attention to these 3 great big brightly colored boxes, which are just kind of the main points of what this slide is about. On the right there, we've got kind of a phylogenetic tree of all the different extant insect groups and how they're related to each other. And we're going to kind of drill down through these as we go from top to bottom. We go from the more primitive to the more advanced or I think some evolutionists probably might object to me using the terms primitive and advanced. They would say basal and derived, but we all know what we're talking about here. So up at the top in the blue box, we've got plant feeding insects are found predominantly in 4 main groups. The first one is the orthopteroids. These are the grasshoppers and katydids and their relatives. And then the next group are the hemipteroids. These are the true bugs. So a fun fact, all bugs are insects, but not all insects are bugs. And so when an entomologist tells that joke, they're referring to this specific group, the hemipteroids, because those are the true bugs. Other groups include beetles, flies, and, oh, you're seeing something I'm not. And moths and butterflies, those are actually not bugs if you talk to a pedantic entomologist. I used to be like that. I'm not like that anymore. Call them all bugs. That's fine with me. I even call like crustaceans bugs, you know, they're critters. And then we've got the beetles as another major guild, and then the Lepidoptera. These are the moths and butterflies. There are a couple of additional plant feeding groups that I will point out. We won't spend a lot of time on them, but the first is the Hymenoptera and wasps. And people think, what? There's plant feeding wasps? There actually are. Plant feeding was kind of a major part of the evolution of this group. And so we will touch on that because it's really interesting. And then Diptera and flies. And again, you know, people don't normally think of flies as plant feeders, but there are a few groups, mostly as a secondary adaptation. I'll make this point that most plant feeders do belong to these more derived groups. And so that would be the beetles and the lepidopterans. And not coincidentally, these are the groups that have that exhibit holometabolous development. This is complete development. This means that there are 4 life stages. There's an egg, a larva, a pupa, and an adult. And essentially what that means is that there's the division of labor between the immature stages and the adult stages. The immature stages have evolved specifically to be the plant feeding, or the feeding, the nutritional phase, and have freed up the morphological requirements for feeding from the adults, who are then free to just focus on dispersal and reproduction. So orthopteroids, these are, again, grasshoppers and katydids and stuff. There's, depending on the classification, there's 1 or 2 or 3 orders of these insects. When I was in school, it all belonged to the order Orthoptera. But they're basically, you know, all of the grasshoppers and their kin. They're mostly jumping insects, walking sticks being a major exception. And for the most part, these are all phytophagous species, almost. You know, they arose a fairly long time ago, late in the late Mesozoic, and it kind of coincided with the diversification of the flowering plants. So especially with what we see in the katydids with their leaf mimicking morphology, you know, this happened as leaves as we know them on the angiosperms came about. Their cousins, the grasshoppers, their evolution is more recent and coincided with the origin and the radiation of grasslands across the world, which didn't exist too long ago. I mentioned that most orthopteroids are phytophagous. There are exceptions to this. This is one of my favorites. This is called the red-eyed devil, and it's actually a predaceous katydid. And I encountered this specimen, this individual, in Big Bend National Park when I was hunting through some sodal plants looking for beetles that breed in the basal crown, and this thing jumped up at me. And in life, those eyes were fiery red. And this was pretty close to the pose that it took. And I swear to God, that thing just almost scared me to death. And they can give you a bloody nip if you handle them carelessly. So while we're focused on mouth parts, let's talk a little bit more about that, because insects have a few different types of mouth parts. This is the simplest division that we can think of in terms of whether they bite or they suck. So this would be, so examples of chewing mouth parts, as in this tiger beetle. Can people see the pointer? Okay. Are people online seeing the pointer, or should I change it to
Yes,
yes to the first part or to the second part?
we can see the pointer.
Okay, great. Thank you. Because I can't see it on here. Okay, so here we have a tiger beetle. These are mandibles. These are chewing mouth parts in about as obvious a form as possible. And obviously, I mean, that's exactly what they do. They chew their food material. In the case of plant feeders, they're chewing plant material. And most plant feeders, because they belong to the orders Coleoptera, which is the beetles, or Lepidoptera, the butterflies and moths, have chewing mouth parts. The big caveat to that is that adult moths and butterflies don't have chewing mouth parts. They have sucking mouth parts. So here's an example of how the evolution of holometabolism, or the division of labor between the immatures and the adults, allowed the morphology of each stage to specialize precisely for what their job was. In the case of moths and butterflies, the larvae remain plant feeders with chewing mouth parts so that they can consume large quantities, large volumes of plant tissue, whereas the adults, they only need plants for quick energy, for flight. They don't need to consume a lot, and nectar from flowers provides that source. So they've evolved a tubular mouth part that allows them to access that nectar, and they don't have to put a lot of evolutionary energy into developing chewing mouth parts, so they have to spend time chewing to get the energy that they need. Other insects that have the sucking mouth parts are the true bugs, and of course the flies. But in terms of plant feeders, it really is the true bugs. And here's a cicada, and you can see the proboscis that this insect uses to pierce the plant tissues and then feed from inside the plant. So while we're talking about hemipterans, let's take a little bit of a closer look. I mentioned their piercing, sucking mouth parts, and it's actually a modification of the mandibles. It's actually the same mouth parts. They have the same homology, but they've just been modified into an extreme form where the two mandibles form a long tube that has a couple of chambers inside, one of which allows for them to inject saliva into the plant tissue, because many of these exhibit what's called extraoral digestion. So they inject saliva into the plant tissues. The saliva begins to break down the tissues, and then the other chamber is through which they ingest the liquefied contents of the plant. And then that's surrounded by a labium, or a sheath, which is derived from other structures that are around the mandibles of chewing insects, and collectively that's called the beak. And so in this order, they started out as plant feeders. The basal groups, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, are plant feeders. But that beak, and we'll see this in a few different places, how these different structures kind of pre-adapt them to be co-opted and used for something else. In the case of hemipterans, the basal groups all being plant feeders, that beak also turned out that was very useful as for predation, because if they can inject saliva into a plant to digest the plant tissues, well, they can inject saliva into prey, another insect, even animals, mammals, and derive their meals that way. And so here's one of these examples where we see evolution using previous designs for new purposes. And then out of those predaceous groups, plant feeding evolved yet again, because these predators are always probing, you know, that they find insects. Maybe one gets hungry, starts probing on a plant because he's just got to have something, and that allows for the evolution of plant feeding forms that preferentially feed on plants. So here's what that looks like. So the black boxes with the yellow letters, those are the basal groups of the Hemiptera. And they're called Sternorhyncha, which is the aphids and whiteflies, and Echinorhyncha, which are the cicadas and the leaf hoppers, tree hoppers, and all that. And their major difference is how they feed. The Sternorhynchans feed directly from vascular bundles of the plants, whereas the Echinorhyncha and all of the subsequent hemipterans that do feed on plants exhibit this practice this extraoral digestion. These groups that I don't have highlighted here, these are all the predaceous groups, and you can see how they sprung out of these basal plant feeding groups. But then way down, very end of this phylogenetic tree, we had the arrival of these plant feeding groups, the Pentatomomorpha. These are the stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs, and these are the vast majority of bugs, plant feeding bugs especially, that most people are aware of. And then combined with the Semisomorpha, you know, so these would be plant bugs. I mean, that's actually their common name for this group is plant bugs, but this would include things like the tarnished plant bug and other related species. Now here's one of the minor groups that's kind of loosely related to the hemipteroids, the Thysanoptera or the thrips. An interesting thing about this group is that thrips is both the singular and the plural form of this name. So you can have one thrips, you can have two thrips, but you can't have a thrip. That's an incomplete word. They've further modified the sucking mouth parts exhibited by the hemipterans into what's called a rasping sucking mouth part. And they're actually asymmetrical. So part of the mouth parts retain that tubular stylet construction that allows them to suck up plant liquids, but another part of it has been remodified back into sort of a mandible that they use to rasp and kind of roughen the surface and injure it to allow fluids from the plant to come to the surface where they can imbibe them. And as far as importance to mankind, this is a seriously pestiferous group. There are many species that are serious pests of agriculture, including lots of glasshouse crops, especially. Question in the back.
What are the spheres on the top picture?
The question was, what are the spheres on the top picture? The black spheres you're talking about?
Yes.
Poop. Yeah, that's so I just can't see. There we go. So you're talking about these? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's feces. That's the nymphal form of the thrips, and then these are the adults. But of course, the true eating came with the evolution of these holometabolous insects that divided their life stages into nutritional acquisition and reproduction in the adult stage. So all of these groups have basically a grub-like immature stage. In moths and butterflies, it's called a caterpillar. In beetles, it's called a grub. And but they all are essentially sacs with mandibles attached to the front, into which they stuff chewed up plant material as fast as they can to acquire as much nutrition as they can during the time that they have. Their ability to do so relating directly to the success of the adult and being able to have sufficient energy and capabilities to find a mate and disperse and reproduce. Yeah.
What does phytophagy mean?
The question what does phytophagy mean? And that means they like plants.
Oh, phytophagy?
Phytophagy or phytophagy. You'll hear plant feeding insects referred to as phytophagous insects versus carnivorous insects, which would be predaceous insects. So yeah, you know, the first of these groups that we're going to talk about are the beetles. The largest animal order on Earth, almost 500,000 described species. I think it's 25% of all known life is a beetle. Obviously, one of the reasons I've become so enamored with them. Obviously, with that kind of diversity, it's kind of hard to pigeonhole them into what their biology and lifestyle is. It's extraordinarily diverse, but they basically arose as insects that were living in enclosed situations, so under bark and under leaf litter, and they needed the protection of they used their forewings and made them harder evolutionarily. We all know how that works, to protect the hind wings that they used for flight. So now they only use their hind wings for flight. Their forewings have become these hard protective covers. That led to the ability for all sorts of new evolutionary things, such as there's lots of aquatic beetles. They can hold an air sac underneath those elytra. It allows them to withstand extreme temperatures and lack of moisture. Beetle groups are some of the most diverse desert insect groups that there are, because they have the ability to control moisture loss with that hard exoskeleton. And so while the earliest groups of beetles started out as fungi feeders and detritus and saprophytes, pure plant feeding has arisen several times in this order. So these are some examples. Most of the plant feeding beetles tend to be in the, again, more advanced groups, such as longhorn beetles, leaf beetles, down here, seed weevils, and actually even ladybird beetles. We think of ladybirds as mostly as predators, and for the most part they are, but there's one group of ladybird beetles that has arisen, that this is the relatives of the Mexican bean beetle, and they developed plant feeding as an alternative life strategy. Then we have the lepidopterans, the moths and butterflies. Again, the vast majority of these are also phytophagous, but again, like anytime you say always, you have to say almost always, because there actually are some predatory caterpillars that live in Hawaii, I believe. And most people think of butterflies and moths as two different groups, but actually they're all one group. Butterflies are just a small, specialized subgroup of moths. They've developed the ability to retain noxious chemicals in their body, and they've developed day flying habits and bright colors to advertise that fact, so that they're not limited to nighttime activity. Some more examples of the feeding phases of lepidopterans. Some of the most extraordinarily beautiful insects on Earth are lepidopteran caterpillars. And then we have the last group, major group of the hymenopterans, wasps, bees, and ants. Again, so most people don't think of hymenopterans as plant feeders, but they owe their whole evolution to plant feeding, because the basal groups were and still are plant feeders. We'll see this in the next slide, but the evolution of the Hemipterans revolves around the development of this piercing, stinging ovipositor. So like the Hemipterans figured out that if you could develop a piercing, sucking mouth part to feed with, the Hymenopterans figured out that you could develop a piercing ovipositor to place eggs inside of plant tissues rather than on the surface where they're subject to parasitism and predation. And so the very basal groups, that's what they do. They're called sawflies and horntails, and they actually inject their eggs into the plants. Well, when you have an apparatus that allows you to sting a plant, it's very easy to co-opt that and use it to sting something else instead, animals or other insects. And so from that sprung a big, diverse explosion of what are called parasitic hymenopterans. They have stingers, but they don't sting us the way we think of a honeybee or a wasp stinging us. They sting other insects and use their ovipositor to inject an egg into that animal. And then that egg hatches, feeds on the tissues inside while the host is still living, avoids the vital tissues until the very end, when it consumes all of those and the host dies and the new adult parasitic wasp emerges. Well, if you can evolve a stinger to inject your egg into another plant or animal, well, maybe you don't really need that, but you've got this stinger that you can use for something else, like defense. And so that's how that led to the evolution of the bees and wasps, which don't use their ovipositors as oviposition devices anymore. They use them as defense mechanisms to deliver a powerful sting. And so you can see how these novelties that were developed around plant feeding also led to the evolution of other novel traits. So here's what these sawtails and hornflies look like. This is a larval sawfly. Now you notice they look very much like a caterpillar, a lepidopteran caterpillar, but they're not. And there's some technical differences that allow you to distinguish them. These are what the adults of those look like. And then these are the horntails. And here I have a sequence of photos showing a female horntail using her ovipositor to drill down into the trunk of a dead tree, and she will lay an egg in there, and then that larva will develop internally on the feeding on the dead wood. Finally, there's flies. And here's another group where plant feeding was a result of evolutionary novelties, because most of the primitive groups, we think of mosquitoes and black flies and gnats, they have aquatic larvae, and the adults are either blood or mammal fluid or vertebrate fluid feeding insects. And then we had plant feeding evolve secondarily out of that. Examples would be the Hessian fly, which the larvae feed internally in the stems of their host plants, including wheat. But adults of many of these groups, regardless of what their larval stage feeds them, are important pollinators. So there's an important plant feeding component there. So that concludes the run through. I hope I haven't gone through that too quickly and that there wasn't too much information to get you all confused, but hopefully that will be helpful as we start going through just a variety of examples of plant feeding and how either specific to the species or some other characteristic that these insects are. Immediately, when you talk about host plant specialization in insects, most naturalists think of milkweed, because it truly is a remarkable system, plant insect associate system. Of course, milkweeds have evolved these cardiac glycosides and milky like latex fluid that evolved really as a strategy to prevent plant feeding. Of course, insects are pros at the evolutionary arms race, and so there's a whole guild of insects that have evolved the ability to feed on milkweed and actually thrive. A common feature among all these insects is that they've also themselves learned to take up these noxious chemicals into their own tissues and make them distasteful to their own predators. And so most of them are really conspicuously colored, usually in themes of orange and red and yellow and black, but quite prominent. You know, the best known examples here, at least in this area, would be the monarch butterfly and the milkweed tussock moth. And any native plant gardener will see these on their plants. And but they're not the only things that you can find. There's quite a few other milkweed associates. These are small milkweed bugs. There's several species of milkweed bugs. The milkweed bugs, of course, they have these piercing, sucking mouthparts, so they don't feed directly on the foliage. They instead feed on the developing seed pods. Now, if you're a commercial milkweed producer and you're operating on tight margins, and that, you know, a percentage point of yield makes a difference between whether you're being profitable or not, then you're going to want to control these guys. If you're not that person, please leave these. Let them do their thing. They add to the ecosystem that you get to enjoy, and are beautiful and colorful themselves. Now, whenever you see what you think is a milkweed bug, you need to make sure that it's on the right host plant, because there are false milkweed bugs. This is Lygeus turcicus, and is a very close relative of the small milkweed bug and looks almost identical to it, but you can always immediately tell because it's always on Heliopsis instead of milkweed. Now, I don't know if that's a secondary evolution or if the milkweed bug itself has evolved from something like this, but it's interesting that that it still retains this black and red coloration, even though it feeds on a non-noxious plant. There are beetles, lots of beetles that feed on milkweeds. This is the small milkweed leaf, the swamp milkweed leaf beetle. Despite that common name, Lepidoptera flivicollis, it does feed on most other milkweeds as well, and even related genera that belong to the family Asclepiadaceae. And again, orange and black, red and black, very slow moving, so they're not afraid of being seen. And then milkweed beetles. This is obviously my favorite group. They belong to the family Cerambycidae, which is one of my core groups. People may not realize that we have a lot of species of milkweed beetles. The most common one is this one on the left here, the common milkweed beetle, Tetraopes tetraophthalmus. But and it's pretty well, what people may not realize is that each species of milkweed beetle is pretty well restricted, at least for larval development, to only one or a couple of milkweed species. So when you find milkweed beetles on different species of milkweeds, they're likely different species. For example, the one on the right here, this is Tetraopes texanus, which I have found on green-flowered milkweed in the glades of Jefferson County. It's not been found anywhere else in Missouri except in the far southwestern prairies, where it also feeds on Asclepias viridiflora. But it's apparently restricted to that species, much less common than the common milkweed beetle. And then here's another one that's a little bit more, it's not quite so rare, but it's certainly not as frequently encountered as the common milkweed beetle. This is Tetraopes quinquamaculatus. And this is this one is on Asclepias viridiflora, but it's, in terms of larval development, it seems to be confined to Asclepias tuberosus, or butterfly milkweed. There's a relationship between, so all of these different species of milkweed beetles, some of them are larger, some of them have more red, and there seems to be a relationship between the size and the amount of red on that species with the relative toxicity of the milkweed species that it feeds on. So some of the more basal or primitive milkweeds the milkweed beetle species that are associated with them tend to be much smaller and to tend to have much more areas of black on them. And they're also flightier. So they're much quicker to take flight on their approach, as opposed to the species that feed on the more recently evolved and more noxious milkweed species. They tend to be bigger and brighter and more red, very little black. And they really kind of don't care if you approach them. They'll just sit there. So, and the research that's been done on them indicates that the milkweed beetles co-evolved cotemporally with the milkweed species that they are associated with. So the milkweeds did not evolve and then these beetles adapted to them. There were just few milkweed species then and few milkweed beetles. And then as the milkweeds have diversified, the milkweed beetles have diversified right along with them. Let's look at examples in other plant groups. Some of these you may be familiar with, some maybe not, but they're always a treat to see. These are cactus bugs. This is one of the leaf-footed bugs, family Coreidae, that's in that Pentatomomorpha that you saw at the bottom of the phylogeny of the Hemiptera. And these are restricted to Puntia. And I guess this says Opuntia humifusa. I think that's been changed now to Cespitosa. Opuntia has Cespitosa now that we have in Missouri. But yeah, they're restricted exclusively to that. So you can only find these in Missouri wherever you find native cactus. These are woolly maple aphids. They're pretty spectacular to see. This picture doesn't quite do them justice, but those are adults and nymphs, a large colony, and they exude this waxy filamentaceous material that presumably has some kind of anti-predator function, but who knows? Obviously, based on their name, you would find these pretty much restricted to maples. Leaf beetles are really some of the best botanists among us. There are many species of leaf beetles that are restricted to single host plant species, or at least to a single genus. This is one example. This is Calligrapha spirea, and it feeds exclusively on nine bark, Physocarpus opulifolius. It's interesting to note that you see the species name is spirea. It was described during the taxonomic history of nine bark, in which that was considered a species of Spirea. And then only later was it separated into a different genus, Physocarpus. And we have lots of different Calligrapha species in Missouri, and they are all very highly host specific. Some related leaf beetles, this is Chrysomela nabi, one of the willow leaf beetles, and these are restricted to Salix. There are other species in this genus in Missouri that are similarly restricted to poplar, which of course is very closely related to Salix. They're both in the Salicaceae. Here's a leaf beetle that is restricted to hibiscus. It's again, most of these host plant specialists, the species name will give a clue as to that. Alpheus hibisci. These things are minute. They measure only 1.5 to 2.5 millimeters in length. And so I had to pull out all the gear to get this picture. This is a really cool group of leaf beetles. Again, these are all leaf beetles that I've been showing. This is the goldenrod leaf miner, Microropala vittata. And this specializes on goldenrod cinculato, the solidago and Euthamia. But it's considered a keystone species because the infestations of this, so as an old field gets invaded by goldenrod and then gradually reverts to forest, at least in our area, the leaf beetles actually help that along because they will move in and really make it difficult for the goldenrod to thrive and reduce the competition that allows the woody plants to gain a toehold and further take over the area. And when those oaks do take over, then there's another guild of beetles waiting for them. This is a different group of beetles. This is the family Buprestidae, or the jewel beetles, I like to call them. I think that's more common in Europe. In North America, they're mostly called metallic wood-boring beetles, but they're not all wood-boring beetles. So this species, for example, is actually, this entire genus are leaf miners. So they've evolved this flattened form. The larvae are even more flattened, but they feed exclusively between the epidermal layers of an oak leaf. And there are different species in Missouri and in North America, and they do tend to be, some of them are very host specific to a single species of oak. Others, such as this one, can be found more broadly on oaks in general. The caterpillar of the Gulf fritillary, Agralis vanilli. That's one of the most spectacular caterpillars I've ever seen. And of course, they're restricted to maypops or passiflora as their host plant. I guess only in the boot heel of Missouri is the only place where I've been able to see these reliably. Another lepidopteran, the American lady butterfly, Vanessa virginiensis, is restricted to just a few related plant genera, one of which is Xanthinaria. I think the species that we have is now called Parlinii. It used to be Plantagenet folia. But anyway, these caterpillars are easy to find once you figure out what their feeding looks like, because they don't consume the whole leaf. They just skeletonize the surface and leave the lower epidermal layer intact when they're small, and then when they get bigger, they'll actually tie these leaves together. So I pulled that apart. You can see here's the silk knots that it had used to tie the leaf above it. But as you're walking through the forest in the springtime, you can see patches of Anthinaria with these whitish looking leaves, and know immediately that that's due to feeding by this caterpillar. Here's a really incredible caterpillar that I found on hibiscus, and it does feed exclusively on hibiscus. This is Tarachi delecta, or the mallow caterpillar. I don't know if it's aposematically colored. It kind of seems to be, but there's no information on that, and I'm not aware of hibiscus plants being particularly noxious themselves, so it's an open question. Moths come in all shapes and forms, and some of them even look like wasps. This is a species, Euhagena braski, that belongs to the family Ceciidae, and these are the so-called clearwing moths, mostly mimicking wasps, generally species of Polistes and other paper wasps. But these also are host specific. This species develops in the root crown of evening primrose family plants. We have, so this was out in Nebraska, but we do have an eastern relative, Euhagena emphytiformis, that does occur in the glades in Jefferson County. So I presume I've seen it there, but I'm not specifically associated with the Oenothera species that we have there, which is Gaura and Macrocarpa. But presumably, at least Macrocarpa, I would think that it breeds in the root crowns of those plants. Bagworms are not really truly host specific, although they do seem to focus greatly on a guild of plants, basically the evergreens. Although I will note that you can find them in outbreak numbers on just about any plant. As Rich and I saw down in southwestern Missouri just 2 or 3 weeks ago, they were feeding on everything, even sycamore, all sorts of deciduous trees. But it was noteworthy that all of the junipers in that area were just completely brown. So they'd hit those and run out of food and were just eating whatever they could. I just wanted to show this as well because it's so unusual to see males of the species. People are very familiar with the bags that the caterpillars develop in, and then the female actually stays there. She never leaves that bag. And you'll notice the tail the tail end of the abdomen here of the male, it's actually prehensile. He can move that thing around. And what he does is he uses that to go up into the bag where the female remains sequestered and mate with her. So he doesn't actually have to enter the bag himself. He just mates with the bag and gets it in the right place. This is a really cool moth. This is Pyromorpha demediata, the orange patch smoky moth. This belongs to the leaf skeletonizer moth family, the family Zyginidae. And these specialize not only on oak leaves, but on oak leaf litter. So it not only has to be oak, it's got to be dead oak leaves. Presumably at a certain stage of decay, at some point it becomes too decayed and they can't utilize it. But as you might guess from the black and orange coloration, they're either aposematic or they're mimicking an aposematic insect. And in this case, it's doing both because there's a group of beetles called netwing beetles, family Lycidae, that also look very much like this. They are noxious, but this is noxious as well. And so it's a nice classic example of Mullerian mimicry. I don't want to forget about the hymenopterans. These are some more of those basal feeding groups of sawflies. And many of them do exhibit a fair degree of host specificity. So these are willow sawflies, Nematis ventralis. And again, they are wasps. They're not caterpillars. I guess I wouldn't mind if you call it a caterpillar if you saw it, but maybe a hymenopterist would say, no, that's a wasp immature or a wasp larval stage. But again, here we have some coloration that's suspiciously aposematic, and it turns out that it probably is. One of the coolest hymenopteran plant associates that I've run across is a species of gall wasp, Anastrophis lygodesmia epicum, which is associated exclusively with Lygodesmia gensea in the Loess Hilltop prairies of northwestern Missouri. There's only about 50 acres of that prairie left. Only about half of it is in conservation management. And if that plant is ever to be lost from those remaining remnants, then this wasp will also be. So you can see that providing conservation for the host plants will often result in conservation of lots of associated insects. The case of this wasp, like all species in the family, they pierce the plant material and they inject an egg. But when the egg hatches and the larvae starts growing, it starts secreting hormones, plant growth hormones that direct the plant to form these gall-like structures around them, within which they can safely and abundantly feed and never see the light of day until they're a full-form wasp and chew their way out. Real quickly, pollinators, just because a lot of them are real pretty and everything, but you know, even though they may not be feeding on the plants, they're definitely dependent on these plants for an important part of their life stage. Soldier beetles, I'm sure you've seen these very commonly coming into this time of year where they feed on goldenrods and sunflowers and can be quite abundant, but they are providing pollination services when they do that. There's a lot of jewel beetles that are pollinators, mostly spring feeders in the genus Acmeodera. This is Acmeodera tubulus and it's feeding on the flower of Monarda bradburyana. Longhorn beetles, there's a whole group of longhorn beetles called flower longhorns that have adapted to daytime activity, and they feed on flowers and provide significant pollination surfaces. This is a pretty rare one. This is Typoceras deceptus, which as far as Missouri is, we've only found it at Trail of Tears State Park, where we've found it on wild hydrangea flowers. We have no idea what the larval host is, but like most flower longhorns, it's probably well decayed hardwood of some type. Whenever you see ants feeding on flowers, take a close look because they might not be ants. There's a lot of different insects that mimic ants, beetles especially, and including longhorn beetles. This is one of my favorites, Tilliclitus geminatus, and it's feeding on a flowering dogwood flower. And these are extremely rare, so it's always a treat to see some of these unusual species by looking at what you think might be pedestrian species. I can't let a talk go by without talking about my beloved wood-boring beetles. So bear with me here. Where's the beetle? Can you see it? And one of the best examples of crypsis that I've ever seen in a family that's known for species being cryptic. I call this conspicuous crypsis because when you see the specimen by itself, especially a pin specimen in a unit tray, it's all white and everything. They have these fantastic coppery metallic colors, and you think, my God, this thing is so gaudy. Until you see it in its native habitat and see what the function of that coloration is. So this is the persimmon borer, Dicerca obscura, and they breed almost exclusively in dead persimmon. They will at times test other things, but for the most part, you only find them associated with persimmon. We had the leaf beetle that feeds exclusively on 9-bark. There's also a wood-boring beetle, 9-bark borer, that feeds almost exclusively on 9-bark. Again, this is Dicerca puginata, and this is from a famous population that I found in the glades of Jefferson County, where I found them quite reliably, and it seems to be very uncommon elsewhere. But again, they're restricted to the stems of 9-bark, and where the larvae breed in the probably not completely dead, but like half dead, half live, and they'll mine that interface between the living and dead tissue. A few species, though, Agrylus. If you've never heard of the genus Agrylus, you can't call yourself a zoologist, because Agrylus is the world's largest animal genus with more than 3,000 described species. So if there's any trivia that you take home that one. So we have around 60 species of Agrylus just in Missouri. We have probably 150 species in the US, and then 3,000 worldwide. Many Agrylus, they're just like the leaf beetles. They tend to be very host specific. This is one of them. This is Agrylus pseudophalax, and it's restricted to dead twigs of honey locust. There are other Agrylus also associated with honey locust, but they divvy up the resource. So Agrylus phalax has the dead twig market. Agrylus difficilis, this one, has the living tree market. So they're one of the few Agrylus species that actually bore in living trees. They don't wait for them to die. Here's another Agrylus that is associated with living trees, and this is Agrylus fusipennis, which we're back to our host persimmon. All of these, or many of these living tree species tend to be rather uncommon. This one's quite uncommon, and this is one of the rarest of all. This is Agrylus consinus, which until I started doing my work here in Missouri was known from only a handful of specimens, and I had maybe a half a dozen states. And by repeatedly going down to Otter Slough Conservation Area in the Boot Heel, I discovered that this species is not only quite common, but it's associated with the living stems of hibiscus species, rose mallow. And it's out more in the summer, not the spring. People that study these beetles tend not to look for them too much during the summer because for the most part, they all go away. Well, this one, it turns out, is out in pretty good numbers during the summer. So it has an unusual life history compared to other members of the genus, has a very unusual host plant and unusual larval habit. The plants don't need to be stressed or anything. They will attack completely healthy plants, but they don't seem to do much damage to it either. So they kind of live in harmony with each other. And then longhorn beetles. This is the second major group of wood-boring beetles that I study. And of course, most of these don't really care what species it is as long as it's just dead wood. There's a lot of highly prolificous, the opposite of monophagous. So many different host plants that these beetles will feed on, but there are specialists, and some of them are quite attractive. Here's another. So this is Acanthocyanus nodosus, and these beetles, and in the group that it belongs to, really seem to be restricted to pines. And this is another example of that term that I coined, conspicuous crypsis. When you put this beetle, so I found this beetle, sitting there where it is, and it looks quite conspicuous there. But I also watched it crawl about, and after I finished prodding it and everything, it crawled up and it found a crevice in between the plates of the bark where the coloration was much more like what this beetle exhibits, and also especially with the vertical lines representing the fissures between the bark, and it just almost like disappeared. So here's I like this species because it's the first new species that I described. Actually, the first new species I discovered. I described another one before it, but discovered it afterwards. But this is Purpurcinus paraxillaris, which I found in the glades of Jefferson County. And I've directed my wife that she has to scatter my ashes at Victoria Glades, because truly that's where I grew up and became an entomologist. So that all started back in the early 80s. But this is a beetle that came to some of my traps there and was long confused with another species. And I was able to, by the amount of material I was able to collect, I was able to determine that it actually did represent a different species, and described it. So I always take delight in the fact that my first new species was not some tiny little brown thing from, a tropical country. It was a big, beautiful, spectacular longhorn beetle from the eastern United States. It doesn't get any better than that. Speaking of big, beautiful, spectacular longhorn beetles from the eastern United States, this is one that you have a fair chance of encountering if you spend enough time looking at elderberry, Sambucus. It's Desmoceras palliatus, and it is restricted to this plant, and it breeds in the living stems and roots. Again, unusual for the family, which are mostly dead wood borers. And again, very brightly colored, so probably some aposematic coloration going on there. Another spectacular example of a host specialist cerambycid that doesn't breed in dead wood. It breeds in the stems of false indigo, Amorpha fruticosa. This is Megasilene decra. You've probably seen Megasilene robinii, or the locust borer. They can be very common on goldenrod flowers at this time of year. If you go to an area such as Otter Slough, where you have stands of false indigo and goldenrod or sunflowers or eupatorium, around those stands, you have a good chance of seeing this beetle, and it's a real treat to see those in the wild. Another example that has adapted to not only living stems, but not even woody plants. Dectes texanus, there's several species related to it, and they all breed in the stems of herbaceous plants. So this one breeds in the stems of Helianthus and Ambrosia and a few other asteraceous plants. More recently, it's adapted to soybean, and now it's become a pest. So that's not so good. And I'm going to finish with my favorite insect in the entire world. This is the Bumelia borer, Plintocelium suaveolens. It's a species that, again, was known from just a handful of specimens in Missouri until we figured out what its host situation was. It is still restricted to woody plants, but just one, Sideroxylon lanuginosum, or gum bumelia, woolly buckthorn. But unlike most species, which are just simply not capable of doing this beetle lays its eggs at the base of the trunk. The larvae tunnel in, and they tunnel through the main roots of these living trees. And that's really quite a feat when you consider the number of anti-feeding mechanisms that plants have to reject invaders. This is a big spectacular beetle. That's a big larva that's probably 2 inches in length. And yet somehow it's able to overcome the plant's defenses. When you see a pile of frass at the base of a Gumbiamelia tree like that, you know that guy's in there, and that eventually it's going to come out as one of these guys. And so I've had the pleasure of seeing these and documenting their occurrence in pretty much every place in Missouri where Gumbiamelia is found, primarily dolomite and limestone glades. And just in the last couple of years, I've recorded the first known population north of the Missouri River, which seems to be the about as far north as it can be, because that's as far north as the plant gets. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you like my photos or want to read some of my essays, you can go to Beetles in the Bush. And thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions if people have any. Peggy?
So that last beetle, the green, is that a warning color?
So the question was, with this last beetle, is the warning, is the green color warning coloration? Absolutely. These beetles have glands that emit a foul smelling, musky smelling substance. It's not, it doesn't deter me too much, but I can imagine if I got it in the mouth, if I was an avian predator and I got a mouthful of it, I'd be very inclined to spit that beetle out. And so this is a pretty common theme of really flashily, brightly colored, large, conspicuous insects out in the middle of the day, just not caring who sees them.
So is the larva also like bad tasting, like it's like I'm picturing like a woodpecker or something? I know it's in the birds, but.
So the question was, what about the larvae? Is it also bad tasting? That is a little less certain. I can only imagine that the beetle somehow acquires either what it's using or the materials to make it from its host plant, which it would do so in the larval stage. So the question is whether it's able to assemble those components into a foul-smelling liquid before it reaches adulthood. I would probably say no, because in holometabolous insects, ones where you have a larval stage completely different from the adult stage, what actually happens in those insects is that when they pupate, in the case of a caterpillar, it's when they form their chrysalis, the entire body tissues break down and provide fuel for small pockets of cells inside the body that have been there since birth, that are then switched on genetically and grow and consume those liquefied contents of the body to create an entirely new body. So, but I don't know that we actually know the answer to that.
And one more, the ash borer, one that's destroying all the ash trees. What is that? Which, like, where would that be?
Okay, so the question was, what about the ash borer? What is it and where does it fall in this group? So the emerald ash borer is another jewel beetle. It's in the family Buprestidae, and it's also a species of Agrylus. So one of the more than 3,000. It's a native of Asia, and in Asia, it is not a pest of ash, but it evolved, with ash there. The ashes there have been dealing with this insect and have obviously evolved defenses against it. The ashes here in North America have not. And so for some reason, this insect is not stopped when it invades ash trees. And when it gets a free hand like that, it can multiply geometrically until it utilizes the resource, and that's exactly what it's doing.
But it still feeds on ash in Asia.
It feeds on ash in Asia. Mhm. Ash is a whole Arctic genus. Are there any questions from people online?
Also like to check the chat. You might have a question too. Okay, I'm just familiar.
Can't see. It's not advancing. Hold on, doesn't matter. Rich,
Yeah, so why don't you, I think a lot of people might be interested in tiger beetles a little bit. I know they don't eat plants and all that, but I know you are, if you got just a couple of minutes, if you want to describe what it is that makes tiger beetles special to you.
yeah, tiger beetle. So the question from Rich Toma was not a question, just he wanted me to talk a little bit about tiger beetles, since that's another group that I'm interested in. And yeah, tiger beetles are actually predators. They're predator. They're actually unusual in the fact that, so they have their holometabolous insects. They have the larval stage and they have the adult stage, and the larvae are voracious predators. But the adults are also voracious predators. So they just, they have a very active lifestyle. They live in often extreme environments. They're fast runners. So apparently their metabolic needs are not satisfied just by what they get as a larva. But they're a lot of species of tiger beetles tend to be restricted to very specific types of habitats. So you have species that live only along riparian corridors. You have species that live only in dry sandy habitats. You have species that live in open woodland clay substrates. You have species that are restricted to limestone glades. You have a lot of species, especially out west, that are restricted to saline habitats. And they are, depending on the habitat that they're restricted to, plays a big part into their coloration. So most tiger beetles have really spectacular colorations and combination with white markings, and probably it all has some function in predator avoidance. But because a lot of the color seems to be derived from their substrate, the larvae live in the soil. They construct vertical tunnels up to 2 feet deep, and they are ambush predators. They sit at the top of that burrow and wait for something to come close enough by, and they lurch out and grab it, pull it back down. So that substrate seems to have importance in how that coloration develops. So tiger beetles tend to be some of the most polytopic species of insects that we know. There are some species that, if you looked at individuals from different localities from around their range, you'd think you had a dozen different species, but it's all just this polytopy that causes that. So.
Question up here.
I've seen, okay. So I've seen yellow, white, tiny caterpillar-like larvae inside the space-like seed capsule of the dayflower Comolina. Do you know what they are? Oh, I do not. I have not seen those. Can we talk here?
Yeah,
That was Kathy.
that's Kathy.
Kathy, can you tell me a little bit more about that? You may not be able to. Well,
She says you can send you a photo of it.
okay. All right. Yeah, I hate to leave you without an answer completely. So yeah, send me a photo and I'll likely be able to give you some kind of answer. So the next question is, are all plants associated with an insect, or are there some plants that are free from interactions with insects? There are plants that seem to be largely devoid of insects, although I hesitate to say completely. I mean, that's just never happens in biology. But especially some of the more primitive plants, like, you know, the cycads and the ferns. Certainly the bryophytes seem to have very few insect associates, although there are associates known, but they tend to be very host specific. And so I don't know that they've been documented from all of those plants, or if they just don't exist, or because they just haven't been found and documented yet. But certainly the plants like those seem to have far fewer associates than other plants. Just, I can't imagine a pine or any angiosperm that does not have insects associated with it in some way. Question in the back of the room.
Yes, since on a similar note, with ginkgos, since they're considered like a living fossil, if you know of anything that feeds on them or
What was the name of the plant again?
ginkgo,
Ginkgo.
I've not seen it much damage on them per se, but I didn't know if there's have you seen any insects that, you know, interact with it or feed on it, even though they've never evolved together.
So the question was a follow-up to the previous question, asking specifically about ginkgo. And again, I would put ginkgo in that category where I'm not really familiar. I'm not aware of any insect associates with it. Now, obviously, you know, it has a very small native range, and it has expanded, but I'm not even aware of insects that have kind of secondarily adapted to ginkgo.
I've heard somebody say that they've been around so long that they've outlived all their predators.
So John just made the comment, he's heard that they've been around for so long that they've outlived all their predators.
Okay, any other
Going once.
questions for Ted?
Going twice. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Ted. All right, thanks, everyone. We've got the room for another 20 minutes. So if you're here, feel free to sit and visit, talk with Ted some more. And for those online, we thank you, and we'll see you next time.
I have a technical question. I'm interested in what your setup is here because I'm trying to do something like this for my condo association. Where is the projector?
There, so if you do a place like this, it's
Okay,
real easy.
it's just a matter of plugging it in.
You don't want to forget about the audio. So we borrow this piece. That's nice.
That was nice. We need to
I
get
like
one
that
of
better
these.
than the microphone.
I like this.
So we'll just use this from
That
now
is
on.
really a fancy setup.
It's not that fancy. It's actually very basic.
And how is this talking to the projector? The cord, this cord right here. If I unplug it.
HDMI connection into your computer.
HDMI. Got it. Gone. Wow. But it's gone. That's really impressive. Well, it was a very nice presentation, but technologically, this was very nicely done.
Oh, thank you.
It just took us a long time to
Yeah.
get it set up, figured out what we were doing. Well, it was fabulous.
Thank you for joining us in person. Yeah, so the library loans these.